Hey everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you. And here we go, after months of debate and speculation, and that's putting it mildly to be honest, we come to the review of the Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 1. This is of course a continuation stroke sequel of the iconic 80s animated series in the fantasy world of Eternia, where a heroic warrior, He-Man, and the Masters of the Universe conflict with the evil Skeletor to protect Castle Grayskull. Now, Revelation Part 1 consists of 5 episodes and was produced by actor and director Kevin Smith as the main showrunner and Powerhouse Studios, who produced the popular anime series Castlevania. Now, Part 2 will be released sometime later this year. Now, to say that there has been much anticipation, debate and discussion on this series is a massive understatement. Ever since the show was announced way back in 2019 on the PowerCon, there has been a constant online controversy in terms of the original concept, fans' perception of the direction of the franchise, and statement made by Kevin Smith himself, which has provoked a lot of reaction from fans and critics alike. So when it comes to the show itself, there are really 3 perspectives that you can come across it from. You can come across it from a major passionate fan of the He-Man franchise, the 80s version, in terms of how you feel about the characters, what they meant to you, what they stood for, and how much of a legacy they've left upon you in terms of your growing up as a child or a teenager. So you're going to approach this show very much on how the characters are treated. The second perspective is if you are far more invested in the controversy and the drama, as I mentioned before, surrounding Kevin Smith, and also by the various concerns by seeing these classic franchises being plagued by diversity and identity politics. And the third perspective is coming from it really as a newbie, as someone who really isn't interested in any of the supposed drama online, and you're not particularly a He-Man fan. You're just coming to the latest animated content on Netflix and just want to see an entertaining, action-packed, spectacular animated series. So when it comes to this review, I'm going to try and cover this from a neutral perspective, as if you haven't watched the show from the 80s growing up, as if you're not invested in the drama. I'm going to look at this front and center on its own. Now, to be honest, I am somebody who did grow up watching the show during the 80s, and yes, it did have a lot of relevance to me growing up as a teenager, watching those classic cartoons from the Saturday morning era. And I do have a lot to say about this animated show and where they took the characters and certain choices that they made, but I'm going to save that for the spoiler review, and this will be basically a non-spoiler review covering the outline of the show and whether it's good or not and stands alone on its own merit. So we go to the story and a setup, which is essentially the same as what I explained early on within this video, where essentially we are following He-Man and the Masters battling against Skeletor trying to attack Castle Grayskull. And we pick up in the earlier episode, the first episode is titled The Power of Grayskull, where we intercut early on in between the sorceress coming under attack from Castle Grayskull, and we intercut that with Teela's big day, essentially graduating her to become the main commander of the Royal Guard. And then after that, we go full throttle in the fight to protect Castle Grayskull, and what ensures is a truly visually spectacular passage where Skeletor's forces unleashes 4 of their powers, and we really get awesome adrenaline feels full of that action and epic fantasy, which really would get you excited a lot for if you're a He-Man fan or you're not a He-Man fan. We get all of those eye-popping visuals and effects that we saw primarily through the first trailer. The animation in this show truly shines, and we see all of the characters in their full form throughout the battle overall. There is a great and wonderful synergy, I would say, in terms of the action and effects and the soundtracks. And yes, it does reach truly cinematic levels at time. And I was watching certainly the first 15 minutes of the first episode, kind of thinking if you were ever to do a live action He-Man, this would be the direction you would go in terms of that verve and that real sense of energy and tone about it. It really is a fantastic microcosm of what this show should have been overall, covering the 5 or 10 episodes. It really felt almost like a season finale in many ways. But after the first 15 minutes, where we get the very much hinted climatic event, without spoiling it again, you pretty much know what that event involves already, we do get an abrupt turn in terms of the storytelling. We get decisions made by characters that feel very weightless because they're made so quickly and suddenly. We get multiple statements and scenes of dialogue that don't really fit true in terms of the characters because we spent very little time with them. And when we get to the following episodes, the show really feels in such a rush. It blitzes through these mini story arcs that really should have been developed a lot longer. Now, this will, as a viewer, leave you feeling a bit let down after you've watched that epic 15 minutes. That's the sort of storyline that you want to see prolonged a bit more going ahead throughout the rest of the series. Now, following the tone of the series, it remains very serious throughout. There's very little in terms of humour or brightness, I would say, overall. Nothing like what we see from the original 80s version, but the action and the pace is almost relentless. We get multiple fight scenes, chase sequences, very vivid special effects all throughout the entire 5 episodes. Now, this is to the show's detriment as well, because while yes, it may remain a very exciting show to watch visually, it doesn't really capitalise a lot more in terms of the depth of the characters. There are some really potentially interesting ideas and concept, but the show just doesn't take the time to explore them. You just wish the show would just slow down a bit and just take its time a bit more overall in terms of the ideas that it wants to present. Now, I'm not going to say it should be to the same pace as what we saw for the likes of Castlevania, and particularly season 3, where the story beats really tended to meander and not going anywhere. I'm not saying we need that kind of slow burn, but this show really could have done with additional episodes just to build a lot more on the general ideas that it was trying to build. Now, in terms of the characters, yes, the story is centered on Tila, and yes, she is the primary character. And I think in terms of Tila overall, whether you're coming into this as a fan of the show or not, to me, I just think she is a very unlikable character. She's very overreactionary. She's very cynical, as we follow a lot in the first couple of episodes where she feels betrayed following the certain revelation that we see in the first 15 to 20 minutes. And she's just very unappealing as a character. She's very complacent. She blames everybody for her woes. She doesn't really want to trust everybody. You could argue might be a certain justification given how certain events play out earlier on throughout the episode, but it just doesn't compel you a lot to like her character. And yes, we do follow that story beat where essentially Tila has to regroup and team up certain characters in order to try and save Eterna from the fallout of the first 15 minutes. Now, in terms of other characters, for me, I think the best character overall was Evil Lynn. I think she has the one with the best charisma, the best personality, and even, dare I say, a bit of depth. There's actually a slight emotional way as we get to the climatic part of this 5-part episode where Evil Lynn has to make a certain decision, and yeah, you do feel something there because I think it's done well to make her really much more of a conscious character of who she used to be and who she could potentially be. And yes, it is convincing following her various relationships with other characters. She was voiced by Lena Headey, and of course, if you know your Game of Thrones, it's a bit disorientating because you just hear Lena Headey or Cersei, if you like. But I think the voice work of Lena Headey was very well. As with all of the characters, I think the voice work sorted them very well. I did like the voice work in particular of Tila, who was done by Sarah Michelle Gellar. I liked Orko's voice work, as well as He-Man's by Chris Wood as well. So there was nothing wrong with the voice work from the particular characters. And yes, many people hinted at it in the trailers, and it is true, when you hear Mark Hamill as Skeletors, there are those tones of Joker, and I think maybe Mark Hamill maybe should have gone up for a bit more variance in terms of how he interpreted the Skeletor's voice, but that's nothing wrong. When we come to the episode finale, or the final episode within this series overall, and without spoiling it, it is quite the cliffhanger. There is a bit of a shocking moment at the end, without going into too much depth and detail, but then what follows after shortly kind of feels a bit hokey overall, I would have said. I think they should have followed it through a bit better, and when you kind of evaluate that moment again, you do feel maybe this is a bit out of keeping with the overall story. It doesn't really quite make sense overall, but it does keep you invested to really find out what happens in part 2. And I would say that for the most part, you are constantly engaged throughout this series. There are little cliffhangery scenes at each of each episode, and this is something, yeah, you can binge through pretty quickly. There is a serialized story here overall, and yes, at least you were compelled to watch the series all the way through. There wasn't really a terrible episode, I would say. I think the best episodes was definitely episode 1, and I think episode 4 was a very good episode as well, where we focus a lot more about Tila and her potential fears and insecurities as well. But as I said before, this is at base level a very entertaining show if you don't care about the background in terms of the devotion to the franchise or the supposed online drama. I have to say the animation is amazing. Every episode, not just the way that the characters drawn, but the special effects, especially when we get allusions to the original source of the magic within Eternia, when we visit multiple different landscapes and environments, and we see the powers and abilities exhibited very much from the likes of Evelyn, and Orko has a very standout sequence again, very much a continue of what you saw from the first trailers. The animation is outstanding, and on the one sense, this is the production and scope level that you want, that is worthy of a He-Man series. It's just the story beats and the characterizations, for the most part, that really let this show down overall. So if I was to sum this up, this basically is not a sequel. This is not a sequel to the 80s. This is not a continuation of the 80s. And I think, again, we'll talk about this more in my spoiler review, how they really have ballsed up massively, I would say, in terms of the overall marketing and tone of this. This is basically an Elseworld story, very much like the Injustice Gods Among Us. If you know that, basically there was a massive event involving Superman, the death of Lois, he kills the Joker, and then we spark off an alternate reality of events where we see much more of these deconstructive takes on these classic characters, and that's what this is. When we follow through a lot of the iconic characters throughout the story, we see a lot of them, they're broken down, they've lost motivation, they're defeated, they're very cynical, they're very unwilling to really restore Eternia to the way it was. And again, that's going to strike a chord and annoy a lot of fans overall. So that's what this is. Don't treat this as a continuation. Treat this as an Elseworld version of the classic franchise overall. And I think that's the best way to approach it. So overall, if I had to give a score for Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 1, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10. Amazing animation and stunning visuals, but a real rushed feel in terms of the storytelling and the pacing, and I think this could have done with multiple episodes more to support the story and perhaps more depth in terms of the characterizations. And yes, that cliffhanger, while a bit shocking, could have been handled a bit better. The tone is very dark and serious. There's not too much, I would say, that isn't unsuitable for children. I'd say there's one show of minor blood in the second episode. There's an intense transformation scene in the second episode, and then we do get that shocking climax at the end. But apart from that, there's nothing really too much in terms of graphic or R-rated violence, I would say, about the show. So those are my thoughts and feelings on review, non-spoilers, of Masters and the Universe Revelation Part 1. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As I mentioned before, I'm going to do a spoiler review where I do then approach it much more of a fan of the show, and I will really expand a lot more on where they took the characters in terms of this franchise, because there are issues. I do have issues overall, coming much more as somebody who grew up watching the show. And I will also cover as well the perceptions in terms of the online drama, and sadly, a lot of what people were alluding to did bear to be true throughout this show, and there's going to be a lot of outrage. There's going to be a lot of people looking to rip this show apart, so expect to see a lot of videos and articles being made about the show over the next day or two. But like I said before, in terms of a neutral perspective, not a bad animated show, certainly one you could just pick up, binge watch and enjoy on a base level overall. So as I mentioned, let me know what you think in the comments below about this. How do you think it compares? Do you think it's something that can stand alone as an individual piece of animated content? Are you excited to see Part 2? Do you think Part 2 can maybe shift the focus more towards He-Man, and we can get those more classical story beats that we define so much of the character? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Please also hit those like, those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.